Hello and welcome to the second talk of Tel Aviv University and Shandong University Institute for Israel and Judaism Studies. And today we are honored to host Professor Hans-Georg Moeller, he is a professor of philosophy in the University of Macau. Professor Moeller works on Taoism and contemporary society and culture. He is the author of You and Your Profile, Identity and Authenticity, Genuine Pretending on the Philosophy of the Zhuangzi. Both books were written with Paul D'Ambrosio. Another book, The Radical Woman, The Moral Fool, A Case of Amorality, and also a book on the philosophy of the Tao Te Ching. Professor Moeller also involved in two YouTube channels, Philosophy in Motion, which is like animating story from the classical Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, and A Carefree Wandering, which is on contemporary philosophy. So thank you again, Professor Moeller, for joining us today for this talk on Confucianism and religion. And perhaps we should start with a few maybe big questions as can we understand Confucianism as a religion, or can we understand the Confucian tradition in terms of religion, or what is Confucianism in general at all?
Yeah, thanks for having me for this interview or for this conversation, Inbal. Yeah, that's a really big question, and it's difficult to answer it. While you were just asking the question, I was thinking, of course, these terms, both Confucianism and religion, are Western terms, and Confucianism didn't traditionally define itself either in terms of Confucianism or of religion, but nowadays these are common categories that are also applied by Confucians. So I don't think it's problematic to apply either of these two. But of course, Confucianism is a lot of things and has a very long history, as you know very well. So it can be understood as a philosophy, it can be understood generally as a cultural tradition, as a civilization, which is like the Chinese government, for instance, or many Chinese academics, also a Chinese public likes to understand Confucianism. And definitely, I think it can also be understood as a religion. So it is a lot of things and has been a lot of things. That's a short answer.
Yeah. Thanks for when you say that you can definitely understand it as a religion. I would like you to maybe give us some examples or some references to text or phenomenon, which is you can take.
Yeah, on the one hand, there is some kind of canon of sacred texts, right? The classics, which already go back basically to the Han Dynasty, that is like 2,000 years ago. So we have this, which, like for instance, Judaism has, or the religions in the Abrahamic tradition, right? That's a very important element for these kind of religions. And Confucianism has that too, in a certain sense, right? A certain canon of texts which are, regarded as somehow basic, not only for the tradition itself, but also as having some form of foundational value for civilization and the world in general. And then, of course, over time, there are also all kind of religious practices, like, whatever, temples and rituals that evolved over the course of time. And so, in this sense, it can be called a religion. Well, but of course, it's also not really a religion in the sense of the Abrahamic religions, in the sense that it is not theistic. certainly not monotheistic. There can be an argument. Some people argue that some forms of belief in some form of divine powers is also present in Confucianism, and I wouldn't deny that. But it's certainly not a theistic religion in the strict sense of the word. Then there is not any kind of strict religious organization. And definitely it's also not an exclusive religion in the sense that, you have an affiliation with it that excludes affiliations with other religions. It also doesn't really have a specific kind of belief system, right? There is no story around whatever kind of religious founder that necessarily has to be accepted. So there is also not, as you have like in Judaism, I suppose, a strong feeling of a certain group of people that constitute Confucianism as opposed to others. So in this way, it's very different from what you might expect from an Abrahamic religion perspective. But I guess nowadays, from the perspective of religious studies, at least, we have a far wider concept of religiosity. So
it seems, thank you. It seems like in the academy, when we study Confucianism, mostly we studied it as a philosophy or a tradition, or and part of the history of the Chinese civilization or the old maybe East Asian area, right? Also Japan and Korea, some of the Southeastern Asia states as well were influenced by the Confucian tradition. And also I think the Chinese government today identified Confucianism as one of the three Chinese religions, right? Sure. Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Like the Sanjiao, the three religious, the three Chinese religious, right? Yeah. But when you talk, but I think for me, I always study Confucianism as a philosophy, as maybe a whole system of thinking or way of life, maybe. Right. Wisdom, ancient wisdom, like the Greece, Platonic or Aristotelic wisdom that grew up in a certain area and developed into a more, for what I see, a more social and political expressions of these, a system of thought.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned socio-political aspects, and I think that's, at least for me, is also very crucial from my perspective. I think Confucianism, and I guess we agree on this, is centered on what sometimes is translated as filial piety, right? The value of xiao, which means basically the moral value of emotional and behavioral commitment of the children toward the parents, and then more generally of the younger generation toward the older generation. Yes. And around this kind of core, let's say, moral value, you have both an ethics, a philosophy, but then you, of course, also have certain religious practices that are attached to it, like ancestral services and rituals and things like this. But then, importantly, like I like to call it, a regime of sincerity that is which, following Roger Ames, who speaks of it as role ethics. So I think the term regime of sincerity is somewhat more critical, if you want. But the idea is basically that the notion of xiao, of filial piety, is directly connected with what Roger again calls a role ethics, that human identity is based on family roles, and that the roles within the family determine who you are and what you got to do and what is valuable to you. And then very importantly, also how you behave, right? And for me, the notion of sincerity, following Lionel Trilling, basically means a concept of human identity, of personal identity, based on role commitment. So I really see this as a centerpiece of Confucianism, that you define yourself and you lead your whole life in reference to the roles and relationship that emerge from within the family,
And
that
also
extends very strongly also beyond the family to the whole social sphere and to the whole understanding of society and of politics. So that's what we call the regime.
And also, regime and continuity as well, right? Here is the question of the continuity when you are valuing family roles and family behaviors, or like family relationships, right? When you try to promote or support or develop your family relationships, you also doing or focusing continuity, right? The continuity of the tradition, of the family line, of the family tradition,
yes,
of culture.
I think this is really central, that what this regime of sincerity does is that it basically ensures the absolute commitment of the younger generation to the older generation, and thereby the absolute commitment to the continuation of the family into the future. And also,
but what is so can you understand the family as as a religious phenomenon, or this idea of cultural continuity as a religious phenomenon? Or?
Well, I mean, this idea of that we have a close connection between notions of the family and notion of the religion, that is by no means, that is very common also to the Abrahamic religion, right?
Right.
Where also the relationship to God is often seen in terms of a relation between father and children, right? I think that's also the case in the Jewish tradition, or isn't it?
It is, yeah. So if we look, so it's a question of the authority, or the we can call it like the power that is above us.
Right. Yes.
In religious terms, so we usually when we speak, of course, on the monotheism, we talk about a divine God, which is like absolute and transcended to our world, but
right. And of course, this level of transcendent in Confucianism, I would say, is much lower than in the Abrahamic religions. I'm not saying it is like totally absent, right? And then, of course, it's not monotheistic, so that you don't have this one father God, but you have the devotion to the kind of deified ancestors of your clan. Again, this isn't the same register as in Judaism or in Christianity, but the connection between the family model and some form of religious dimension is equally there. It's just that the religious model operates less on the basis of transcendence and less and not monotheistic, and so to speak, the divinity is much closer to you. I like this book title from the 1970s by this American philosopher Herbert Fingered, "The Secular is Sacred."
Yes.
And I think this really sums it up very nicely, right? So the family unit, which is very secular, at the same time is somehow a sacred space.
Because of the authenticity and continuity,
Well, you shouldn't use the word authenticity, because I think that's a distinction, at least for me, that is very important to make this distinction between authenticity and sincerity. So my whole point is that in Confucianism, we have a regime of sincerity, which is very different from authenticity. Yeah.
Sincerity is a more like what, like Cheng, the idea of wholeness,
and of course, in Chinese, the term is Cheng, which is very central to Confucianism. It's very central to the Zhongyong, which you've been working on, but also to many other texts. And that can be translated with sincerity. But again, like I take the notion from the contemporary literature scholar Lionel Trilling. And for him, it basically means similar to, I think, what Roger Ames talks about when he talks about role ethics. It means that you build personal identity, that the notion of personal identity, the understanding and the practice of personal identity is based on role commitment. And the commitment, the sincere commitment to the roles you have in the family, as for instance, daughter or wife or mother or father or son. And then you become what you are, and you achieve identity by sincerely committing to the role. And this, as Paul D'Ambrosi and I call it, this is a kind of, there has to be a dual correspondence. So your behavior has to be, you have to behaviorally commit. You have to actually do what a daughter is supposed to do. But you also have, on the second level, to feel as a daughter ought to feel. So you're both on the behavioral and on the emotional and the whole psychological level. There has to be this sincere commitment to the role that you have, and thereby identity is constituted.
So it's different then from authenticity in the way that when I said authentic me or self, I mean like something distinguished from the social role or familiar role that I'm in. And
it's basically a reversed notion of identity, because in the mode of sincerity, the role, the social role is there, and then you commit also, you internalize the role. Whereas the logic of authenticity is the other way around, where
I distinguish myself.
Your social persona is supposed to be an expression of your inner, unique, and original self. So the logic is reversed.
Okay, nice. Thank you for this. And so you understand these role ethics or role identity, right? Or self, which is based on role, familial roles or social roles. You understand it as a religious expression of the Confucian tradition?
Well, there is a strong religious component within the Confucian tradition, right?
Because of the idea of high and low and obedience and...
Well, right. That, I think, should, as I said earlier, should connect, I hope, immediately with someone familiar with the Jewish tradition, right? How that connects also with a certain religious attitude, where this kind of devotion, which is a religious term, right? Sincerity also, this commitment, sincere commitment, takes on the form of devotion. And that's a religious attitude, right? That's
but not toward the divine or like a transcend power, toward to the inner or immediate world that we are living.
To the family and to, so, and that ritualizes behavior, right? It's like devoted behavior is strongly ritualized behavior. It has strong spiritual aspects, but it takes place within the secular realm of the family. But the secular realm of the family is, so to speak, sacralized through the devotion, the devoted mode of enacting sincere role commitment.
Yeah, so I can understand. So if I would be convinced, or you would convince me,
sorry for interrupting. And then you have also ritual, which of course also takes place in the temple, but also the ritualistic space is right in the family, right? So you don't just have to go to the temple in order to, to practice ritualized devotion. You do that in the family and how you interact within the family.
Yeah. So I have two questions following this idea. The first one, so if we want to describe this way, Confucianism as a religion, so whether I can join this religion as a human being, or I should be a Chinese, I should have a Chinese DNA, I should be familiar with the Chinese scriptures or the whole social environment and geographical environment to be part of this religion, or whether I can join it from whatever, because if we speak on family structure, so it doesn't matter actually what is your national or religious or identity at all. So
that's a very good question. It's a very good question. Well, we have this traditional idea going back in history, right? The Chinese are kind of proud of the fact that formerly barbarian neighbors sort of were jiaohua, where friends were civilized, but that in fact basically means jiao is the same as zhongzhao, the jiao, right? It's the same as a jiao you have in religion. So they get transformed through the teachings and adopt the proper civilized way of life. So it's not an ethnic, it has definitely not an ethnic, exclusive ethnic, like in Judaism, you have that element, I suppose, right? So that is kind of absent.
It's not an ethnic, and it's not a question of practicing just the rituals, or the customs that I should do to become a Confucian. It demands me something much more deeper or much more essential, right? The way I experience my whole life should change.
Well, it's also, so it's neither ethnic, but it's also not, there are no specific doctrines you have to adopt. There are no specific narratives you have to subscribe to. But still, you somehow, and the notion of nationalism is very new, so I'm very hesitant to use that notion. But still, there's somehow the idea that because identification is so important, is so central, that you somehow identify yourself with the Chinese Confucian mainstream culture, right? You're part of the Chinese civilization, of this kind of Chinese civilization project. But it's neither a kind of ethnic nor a specifically doctrinal project. But I guess you should, as a proper Confucian, I guess, you should memorize certain core texts by heart. And of course, then definitely you should, this is again, the most important thing, that the personal identification through this kind of role through this role ethics, and thereby also the identification with the tradition.
So I should devote myself for studying and improving myself, right? We have the idea of self-cultivation in the Confucian philosophy. So now you explain it also in a religious way. So if I want to become part of this religious group, let's say the Confucian, I can start practicing these ideas in my own immediate living conditions.
Yes.
And another question I had, whether the family, you mentioned before how important are family roles. This is actually the first place that we learn how to build our own sincere self, right? Do family structure reflect or symbolize any other, maybe more non-human structure?
Yes, of course. I mean, these family roles, which is one of the reasons why I'm not a Confucian, and I'm sympathize much more with the Taoist tradition, which I regard as anti-Confucian in many ways. Actually, not only as non-Confucian, but in many ways as an reaction against Confucianism. And I think one of the major disagreements between Taoism and Confucianism, or where the Taoists say no, is, I think, a core Confucian, let's say, a proposition or a core Confucian claim, namely that the family roles are basically natural. We have the famous passage in the book of Moeller, about the 5 family relations. And the first one is, between husband and wife, and between father and son, and so forth. And these are seen as like, this is like the right and the proper and the natural way to be human. And in order, that is like, things are just set up naturally. So there is the idea that the family and the social structure that the family is something that is somehow a natural, that is naturally set up that way.
So the family is not.
If you don't act in that way, then you're unnatural.
So family is not like artificial product of society or certain kind.
It's kind of an interesting. We have, as we have it in the Mangsa, it still needed the sage kings to actually realize this, right? So it's kind of natural is maybe not really the correct word, because the sage kings somehow noticed that human society were living in a very primitive, uncultivated state. And then they found, okay, so there is the proper way of being human, and just humans didn't really know that. So maybe I shouldn't have used the term natural, because it is misleading.
Okay.
But there is like the standard way, the human way of being human, the civilized way of being human. And this is, so the sage kings understood that and they implemented it. But they didn't, this is like then the unorthodox vision of Xunzi, which was then the tradition rejected, and they accepted the claim by Moeller that this is somehow, they saw what human nature, Xing, that's why it's natural, how human nature can flourish in a civilized form. And they didn't create this, they didn't construct it, which is Xunzi's point, right? They just realized it and then allowed nature to flourish in the civilized way. So just as, you can have, they always use these examples from agriculture, right? In order to, make certain plants productive, you cultivate them in a specific way. And in this way, their natural potentials flourish. And in a similar way, the idea is that the Confucian sages, so to speak, found out the way of life by which the human nature can flourish. So it's this combination of the disposition of human nature and the civilizational framework that allows this nature to flourish. So that's a basic setup.
Yeah. So if I try to compare it with Jewish religion, it's very different. Yeah. In Judaism, it's very clear that the whole idea of respecting your parents or being a nice sister is according to a divine law, which appears in the text, in the sacred text, in the 10 Commandments. You should do it. You should respect your parents. And there is another additional sentence who said that it's better for you, you should respect your parents for your own prosperity as a human species in the world. So in this way, we can understand it also maybe similar to what you just explained on the human nature and the family structure in general, but it's still hard for me.
Like, I mean, that's why, I think both traditions, the Jewish tradition, as you just described it, and the Confucian tradition, this is precisely why we call them religion, because what they do is they basically build up a discourse that tells people certain social structures and certain social hierarchies have some form of trans-social authority behind them, right? They're not just social constructs. They're not just contingent social.
But what are the social authorities in the Confucian tradition? In Judaism, it's very clear. But in the Confucian tradition, what are the sources of these authoritative?
Again, we have like then texts, like I just referred to the monks, but there are many others.
You say the wisdom of the sages. The sages.
And these texts basically say, yes, we had these sages who, realized this is the way.
But they didn't have like an enlightened or like prophecy that they got this knowledge from somewhere.
No, not really.
So,
but there is then a kind of, which again is like we honor, there's this honoring and this, how to say, worship even of these sages, because we're so grateful for what they did. Just like, but again, this is just comes out of I think it's just a kind of a religious narrative and a religious practice that has the function to support a specific social hierarchy and a specific social structure. It's a kind of, a cultural construct, a religious construct that justifies and legitimizes certain social practices and hierarchical social structures. Right? From a Marxist point of view, it's a certain narrative that serves to legitimize a specific socio-political setup, and of course a specific socio-political structure of suppression as well, because in Confucianism, of course, is very, very much it's highly suppressive, for instance, of women.
Yeah, it's also very ancient tradition, so we
it's
can.
What?
Ancient. It's very not up to date. Of course, in the Confucian tradition, if you think about the world of 500 BC, of course, women had no place there. And the whole
idea, they did have a very specific place.
They had a place, yeah. Not in the, the social or political or philosophical or traditional or any textual sphere. In any way, women weren't a part.
Well, I mean, as also the monks of the Mencius says very clearly, right? The most important concrete duty of filial piety is to have a son.
I know, yes.
So the most important function of women is to make sure that there is a son.
Yes, and there is also the husband-wife relation, which is part of the social structure, and also the place of women in the inner world, right?
Right. And it's interesting, like how this, and politically, right? How this the husband-wife relationship is projected into the political sphere, the minister, the superior, and the ruler and his inferiors. Right?
Yes.
So
yes.
that the ministers serve the ruler like a wife serves the husband. Even though they are male, right? So we have also we have something of a sex-gender division there,
right.
in that in a political realm, also people who are sexually males still somehow enact a kind of a female role.
And also the name Ru, right? The Confucians in Chinese is soft, which
Right.
I see as something very feminine.
Right.
The scholar or the Confucian sage is in many ways described as someone very gentle with feminine characteristics sometimes.
Sure. But the feminine characteristics are, they're very directly tied to submission, right? So and of course you have this. That's why it's religious, because it celebrates submission. It celebrates submission, and it makes it establishes a spiritual regime and an identification with submission. I mean, that's what
the submission is very transformative. For example, in Judaism, I'm the human, yes. God is God. Yeah. I'm always in the lower position. I think what happened in Confucianism that it is a very transformative situation or a position, right? I'm a student and I'm also a teacher. I'm a mother and I'm a daughter. So
Of course, and I don't want to totally dismiss submission. I think, of course, also submission, is often important. But the extent to which submission is, let's say, becomes total, and the extent to which submission needs to be internalized and becomes dogmatic, right? That is the whole thing, that it is both internalized to an extremely high extent, and that it becomes a dogma that, it becomes the unquestionable, it becomes absolutely unquestionable. This is, of course, problematic. Yeah, and I see Taoism as very much as a subversion of that. But it doesn't mean that doesn't mean that we have like a modern Enlightenment idea that, we have to completely eliminate all forms of submission, which is, of course, entirely impossible and equally problematic, right? That's where the regime of authenticity comes in, where you have, you overcome all forms of submission. And I'm not defending that, but I mean, that is the whole Taoist approach, right? That you see the problems in all of these regimes. Yes,
but what you see as submission, I can also see as like a tolerance, or maybe a more patient or more acceptable, and even soft position in the world. But we don't have to agree, right? For me, still and yet, Confucianism is a tradition, and sometimes it's even, as you mentioned, Herbert Fingeret, is a sacred tradition. In this text, I can find wisdom. I can find some even answers or hope, as sometimes I find in the Jewish prayers or services. Or of course,
it has find meaning. You can find identity, and you can find meaning. Yes. I'm not so sure about hope
in the
Confucian tradition, right? I mean, there is
not this. If you are mentioned.
I mean, that's something maybe I like about the Confucian tradition, that you don't have that much hope, in the sense of, there is not the idea of some form of, which is central to, I understand, all the Abrahamic religions, right? This idea of the something like the rapture, something like this, the messianic idea, the idea of this kind of the soteriological idea, all the eschatological ideas, right? The messianic ideas. And I think healthily, they're quite absent from the Confucian tradition.
Yes, in this sense, there is no hope in the Confucian tradition, but there is a hope on the human ability to develop and prosper.
Well, to cultivate, right? The cultivation.
The cultivation of the human species, we can even say, yeah, the human.
Yeah, but not really development. Again, I disagree philosophically with your terminology, because development basically means, we grow
Yeah.
into and we mature, which again is like, I think, very distinctive to the Confucian tradition. That the point is specifically not very different from the Enlightenment, where there is the idea of development and maturation, that you shift from a state of being immature to a state of being mature. Whereas
Yes.
in Confucianism, you become ever more, so to speak, immature, in the sense that you develop more and more dependency. You don't become more and more independent. You realize more and more the dependency within the family. So in that sense, there isn't really, in a strict sense of the word, this modern notion of development, right? Where you kind of, you develop and then you develop your identity. And this is a form of you cultivate your, so to speak, your immaturity. You cultivate your submission.
But you do grow, right? You grow as a person and you grow as a society. And if we think
Well,
about
you grow in the sense that you grow into, you grow older, like you grow from a daughter to a wife, to a mother, to a grandmother, to a dead ancestor. That's a growth process. But the growth process is just a process like within the hierarchy, that you kind of, move up from younger to older. But again, like you're interconnected, and that doesn't make you more. You're not in that sense more developed.
For me, I understand it also as a moral growth, of course, as becoming a better human being, and more tolerant to maybe some harmful things.
Well, that's interesting. Can you explain that more?
The moral growth,
Yeah, what you just said.
that you grow to, for me, yeah, the Confucian project, and I also try to write it in my PhD, right, dissertation, according to the Dashwell, one of the four one of the four classics, the Confucian classics, that the whole idea there is to make you as a human being, to develop your own identity, that which you explained in very detailed and smart way, right? In this regime of sincerity and these all role ethics. But the whole idea is to just try to become better human being, not as a person, and not only as a person, but also as a society, also as maybe the tribe or a community or a national group.
But better in which way?
Better in, I think, what as I understand is in when you perform behaviors more, I don't know, sensitive to the other, to be more sensitive to the other person, to get out of your own physical or mental boundaries, expanded your feeling, broadened yourself, right? Du Wei Ming is talking about it at all. And it also relates to the question of like, how universal is this? If we understand Confucian religion or Confucian philosophy in terms of personal or identity or structures or human structures in relation to this social, personal, or individual collective tension, you can also say, okay.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's you're right, and I mean the buzzword they use nowadays is always like harmony, right?
Harmony.
Maximize harmony. So being together with other people, like the same ideas in the family, right? The happy family, that, that these family relations, and as you said, you go beyond yourself, and within these relationships, you maximize the harmony within the group, and it just feels so harmonious and so great and so safe and almost spiritually elevated, or actually spiritually elevated, to experience this kind of emotional resonance and this warmness of human relationships,
right,
in the family and beyond. That's really the idea, right?
and it
But
has also the potential. Okay, sorry.
yeah, and you see that. I mean, you see that. Of course, you see this everywhere. But now living here, like in Macau, in a Chinese context, I think you can feel how this, attempt to kind of build up some form of emotional harmony within the family, how this is like still very central to Confucian culture, but at the same time, I feel very ambivalent about that. I mean, we see the very high suicide rates, and I see the stress that young people are under, and I find it extreme. Yes, on the one hand, there is certainly this emphasis on harmony, but in practice, 2,500 years of practice didn't really.
Yeah, there are many reasons. Yeah, we can think about the reason that we are in Judaism, and I think in any other religion, we can find the same problems, right?
Of course,
same
of
issues
course.
about
I mean,
how.
you have Christianity, like this insistence on love, and really the attempt to cultivate love, right? And how that also didn't at all prevent like a genocide and mass murder and hate to an extreme extent, right?
Yeah, so it happened
Until today, and it's like very present today in fundamentalist Christianity. The degree of hate is still astonishing, right? And they still talk about love all the time.
Okay, I think our time is running up. We will have to stop here, even though it's very fascinating, and I will be happy to continue and talk about all these other issues. And now I'm curious about Taoism and religion and how you will explain that, but maybe we should save it to another talk.
Right.
So thank you very much, Professor Hans-Georg Moeller from Macau University, for this talk.
Thank you, Inba.
And I will